So thanks for being here this morning. I'm Ed Honowitz, and I work for State Senator Carol Liu, doing education policy work. You can tell I work for the State Senate because I'm the only one with a tie here today. So, what I'm going to talk about is kind of a whole set of changes that are happening in public education, both across the country and specifically here in California, and how that relates to both growing and building the workforce in this changing economy, and how we spur innovation and creativity in the workforce in our public schools and our higher education. And so I wanted to kind of start with some context about what's out there. Basically, in California, like most states, education is the single largest line item. It takes up more funding than anything else in the state budget. In this current budget that we're in for 14-15, which is $108 billion for the state of California, 42% of that is for K-12 education, 11% for higher ed. So over half the budget. The good news is we're back to the point where funding for higher education is now higher than funding for prisons. So that's a move in the right direction. So one of the things that I wanted to cover, and there's just a lot going on in public education. Right now, you've probably heard about Common Core standards. Perhaps you've heard that in the news, and that's a pretty significant change. Most education doesn't change much in the course of time. Things are pretty staid, especially in K-12. But the introduction of Common Core is a pretty significant thing, and that's happening nationally. Additionally, the change in the state standards spur new curriculum being developed in school districts. Also, we've had a major change in education funding and how schools are funded in California. There's a thing called local control funding, which basically provides more money to students that are low-income English learners or foster youth. And that's a very significant change. It's a real step forward in terms of equity, and especially from where we were, which was a really, sort of patchwork funding system that frankly made no sense at all. There's also a whole new set of accountability systems that go with this, including, you may have heard, some of you, if you're in some education circles, are working on things related to that. Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium, which is one of two big entities in the country that are doing the accountability testing piece that go with Common Core. And there's a whole host of new technologies that are coming into education. Successful or not, depending on how they're introduced and what the nature of the technology is. So just to kind of give you an idea of what's going on, there's this huge range of change out there. Today I'm going to talk about Common Core, some of the assessment components and Smarter Balance, this issue of some of the change in the funding, and changes in state priorities for schools and what constitutes school quality. And then we'll talk a little bit about a thing called community schools, which is really this notion of how do you get business and nonprofits and social service agencies, et cetera, kind of integrated into the activities in K-12. And that's a hugely important thing because schools basically can't operate and do what we expect them to do on their own. They really need the entire community working with them to affect change and deal with all of the issues in education. So quickly about Common Core, I'm going to give you a quick quiz here. Where did this thing come from? You probably hear Common Core standards in the news. Some of it is controversial. There's states that are pulling out and saying, we're not going to do that, and we're going off on our own. And there's currently 42 states that are part of Common Core state standards that have adopted them. So quick quiz here, and your choices are in terms of where these things came from. They'll be either the Obama administration, the Gates Foundation, the National Governors Association, or the American Federation of Teachers. So how many people think Common Core came out of the Obama administration? Okay. How many people think the Gates Foundation? All right. National Governors Association? All right. American Federation of Teachers? All right, so we've got kind of a mixed bag out there. So yes, all of you that said the National Governors Association get a free Starbucks next time you pay for it up in the... So yeah, basically Common Core came out of a need to increase rigor and increase the standards. What happened when No Child Left Behind, which basically came out of the Bush administration, was put into place, every state had an opportunity to set their own state standards. There were penalties if they didn't meet their standards. So in many cases, they lowered their standards in order to make sure that 80, 90% of kids were passing. What it resulted in was inconsistent standards all over the country. In some cases, luckily, California maintained pretty high standards expected for kids to learn, but in many cases, states really kind of dumbed things down. So the idea behind Common Core was the US has to be competitive in the workforce. We've got to look at sort of benchmarking what we expect kids to know across international standards so that we're internationally competitive. We had to build skills for the 21st century and for the workforce, and sort of address college readiness issues and kind of focus on real world skills. And the things that you'll kind of hear from fairly regularly are the 4 C's, right? That's what the idea behind Common Core is, which is critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. So those 4 C's are probably what you're engaged in every day, right? You're probably not engaged a whole lot in your work life in filling in, a multiple choice test, where it's A, B, C, or D. So the whole concept behind Common Core was raise the rigor, make it more real world, create a, sort of that on-ramp into higher education and the workforce. Interestingly, there's, been some studies like looking at what Fortune 500 companies, value in their workforce. And if you go back into the 70s and look at some of the polling, the top things were writing skills, reading skills, computational skills. And now what you're finding is, in fact, those are still there, they're expected, but it's communication across multimedia, it's teamwork, it's innovation, creativity, a different set of skills. And so we have to make sure that K-12 and higher ed is in fact teaching those skills. I'm gonna make the wild assumption that all of you are sort of the, culmination of what we're trying to get out of our K-12 system, which is folks that are entrepreneurial, that are innovative and creative and problem solvers. So tell me if I'm wrong on that assumption. So going forward, right, there's these Common Core state standards. Again, generated out of the National Governors Association. There was funding from the Gates Foundation that helped spur some of this along. But, you hear things like, the governor of Louisiana or of Kansas, I'm against this national curriculum. We don't want, the Obama administration telling our teachers what to teach and our kids what to think. And, well, there is no national curriculum. It doesn't exist. Not something that anyone has actually ever tried to do in the United States. What there are standards. So what's the difference between curriculum and standards? Standards are basically a set of, here's what we want kids to know. By the end of 4th grade, they will know this. By the end of 2nd grade, they'll be able to, do their timetables. By, 5th grade, they'll write a 5, paragraph sentence, and it'll have a concluding statement. And so those are not really controversial things. Those are standards. Curriculum is, what is the teacher going to do in the classroom to actually teach that? So that might be the selection of textbooks. It might be the lesson plans that they put together. It's the actual units, the interim tests that the teacher's doing, etc. All of that kind of level of implementation detail is set by school districts all over the country. So in California, we've got 1,000 school districts, roughly, and each one of those makes decisions about how teachers are going to teach. But what you don't want is everyone having different standards saying, well, our district thinks, we don't really need to teach this thing at all, or we think that shouldn't be taught until much later, because there's a lot of mobility in kids moving around between districts, and you have to make kind of a logical, sequential education program. So that's kind of what is the difference between curriculum and standards, and why we need to have high levels of standards that have some amount of consistency. Usually the states that bail out of Common Core, like Kansas, created the Kansas state, standards, which are essentially about 90% Common Core, and then they add some things here and there. So part of this whole idea around raising the rigor in order to get to high levels of thinking, creativity, innovation, etc., has to do with moving to higher levels of a thing that they call depth of knowledge, right? So depth of knowledge is sort of divided up into kind of 4 basic categories. So level 1 depth of knowledge are things like, memorize, list, recall, very basic sorts of activities, right? Now, kids certainly know how to, need to know how to do that, but that doesn't get you to an effective workforce in the 21st century. So the idea is to shift around this, I have a graphic here which you can't see, but, essentially to move to these higher levels and deeper depth of knowledge, right, into things like, asking critical questions, synthesizing information, using communication across multiple levels and multiple media, and all the way to sort of this level 4 depth of knowledge, which are things like design, create, critique, prove, apply concepts. So that's where we need to get to, is kids that are working at that level as opposed to, here, memorize this big chunk of facts. Because as we know, while it's important to know a lot of facts, you have in your pocket, in your cell phone, access to more facts than anyone could have imagined a few decades ago. And frankly, that access to those facts isn't going to get you a high-paying job. It isn't going to move the economy. So, Common Core, how do you do that? How do you kind of get to these more complex levels of thinking? Some of the key aspects are things like reading more complex texts. So everything isn't literature-based. You still have literature. You don't want to give that up. But you also need kids that can read the kind of technical manuals and things that you're probably spending a lot of time looking at. You need to have people look at how do you, use evidence to justify your ideas. How do you engage in inquiry and research? On the math side, it's about, sort of using math across the subject content areas and, real problem solving instead of just, yes, I memorized the formula and I can regurgitate it. So that's kind of this big change that's happening across the state. And this is not easy stuff because essentially what you're asking teachers to do is to kind of redesign the work that they do every day. And we used to be very textbook based, and you'll find that teachers that maybe were hired 10 years ago are so very used to show me the textbook, where's the teacher's guide, let me tell you how, that's how I know how to teach. That's not what we want. We want teachers that are really thinking deeply about how to engage their students and are actually involved in designing the curriculum, right? Designing that delivery of those things. Paired up with this change around Common Core is, well, how do you assess any of that? How do you know that kids are actually learning? And that's where these different assessment consortiums, in our case, we're part of the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium. I think there's 20 some states that are associated with that. So they needed to design a system, which in fact is now a big shift because it is computer-based. And you probably, if you've been reading the paper, you've seen some of this discussion about like LA Unified and their whole iPad thing. And, they've spent huge amounts of money on iPads that were supposed to be associated with the testing for Common Core and the Smarter Balance testing. In fact, you really don't need an iPad. You could march kids through a computer lab and not spend a huge amount of money on, tablets and such. But the bottom line is that the thing that's different and unique about this testing is it's computer adaptive. So what happens is the kid sits in front of their screen, they go to take the test, and the server starts serving up questions based on their previous answers. So if they're quickly getting all the right answers, it's going to give them harder questions. If they're not getting it, it's going to go back and give their simpler questions. And the idea is you don't want kids bored, right? Oh, this is easy, I don't have to really even think about this. You also don't want kids going, I'm lost, I can't do this, I'm just going to answer A on everything, or I'm going to just, blow this off because it's frustrating to me. So that's a real technological change that is important and I think will be very powerful going forward. And a lot of this is kind of looking at a whole set of adaptive computer sort of processes, because there's pop-up screens now, there's things to read through, there's other little pieces of information that you can look at that will relate to an answer that you're going to give. It's more real world. It has, again, it gets to this issue of how do you get to these level 4, more deeper, complex thinking skills. So we just went through the first Smarter Balanced test run. This last year was a no stakes, right? And typically every school is judged and, principals can lose their jobs based on test scores and all of these things. But because this was such a big shift and nobody actually knew what was going to happen as they started this whole new process, the state of California, I think very smartly, said, this is no stakes. No one's going to, lose their job. Schools aren't going to be ranked. Everyone's going to take the test, and we're just going to try this thing out. In fact, it was really a way of calibrating the test because they needed to understand, are we asking the right questions? Is it calibrated to what the kids are learning, et cetera? This is a huge shift because even though there is going to be a paper version of this, because there's some schools in remote rural areas that aren't online. There's even schools that don't have electricity 100% of the time. And there's some real kind of basic technology challenges around implementing this kind of new accountability system. But, in many places it's just, is there actual wireless that's working on the day of the test in a classroom? And, lots of little sort of logistical challenges that, again, when you scale it up across 10,000 schools in the state of California, 300,000 teachers administering this thing, et cetera, there's a lot that can go wrong. So this last year was working out the bugs. We're going to see where things go. What we'll probably find is scores will drop. That's what's been pretty typical in most states because kids are just getting used to this new way of teaching. Teachers are getting used to new curriculum, et cetera. So the other, to kind of give you a quick once-over on sort of what does this look like from the standpoint of the kid. Here's a 7th grade reading sample, right? That was, so this would be a test question, right? Roberto paid $43.08 for 3 CDs. All 3 CDs were the same price. How much did he pay for each one, right? Well, so what are you asking the kid to do? They got to read a problem, translate that into, I got to take this number and divide it by 3, and here's the answer. Okay, so that's kind of depth of knowledge 1. Here's a level 4 depth of knowledge, same kind of 7th grade math question. Max bought 2 items that were on sale. One was 10% off. The other one was 20% off. Max says he saved 15% altogether. Could he be right? Could he be wrong? And why? So, you can kind of see this it causes you to really think differently and, well, maybe, are they both the same price going in? What are the relationships between percentages? And, so the idea is to sort of get to much deeper levels of thinking. And that's kind of an example. And the same thing goes for when you look at things like on the language arts side, typically kids will read, here's a 5-paragraph, little story. and then there's some questions about the story, and you have to, it basically tests your ability to, absorb information and such. But oftentimes, even the answers, even if you didn't really understand what you read, the answers sometimes tip you off to, oh, this is the most likely correct answer here. And that is, juxtaposed with this new Smarter Balance research tasks that they're asking kids to do, which would be things like, instead of just read this, answer a couple questions, here's an example. You're the chief of staff of a U.S. Congresswoman. You need to address a proposal by a power company to build a nuclear power plant in your state. And your congresswoman is going to make an announcement about this tomorrow morning. You need to conduct research on the pros and cons of nuclear power and summarize what you learned. Write an evidence-based memo and with a recommendation either in support or in opposition, and address both sides of that issue. So that's way more complex. I mean, and it's what you want kids to do, right? Because it relates to what you're all doing in the workforce, right? You're doing research, you're making decisions, you're balancing pros and cons. So this is kind of where we're trying to go with education. The other big change that I'd mentioned briefly is this whole issue of the funding. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but it's a major important change in the state. It doesn't mean there's loads of new dollars, although as the economy improves, there is more funding going back into public education. But consider that before, at kind of the, going back about 2 to 3 years, California was 49th out of 50 states in per pupil funding. All right, so that's when you do a regional cost of living adjustment. So we were at absolutely, essentially the bottom of all states in terms of funding. And how does that play out? If you go to a typical state, which is much higher funding per pupil, go to an elementary school and you'll see, class sizes that are half the size of California. You'll see that they have a music teacher and a PE teacher and an assistant principal and a nurse and a librarian. And in California, you've got very large class sizes, a principal and an office manager, and that's about it. So, these issues of the per pupil funding really play out in significant ways in the lives of kids. And in California, we also have an incredibly diverse population, and the majority of children in public schools essentially are, live at or near the poverty line. So in Pasadena, as an example, right, there's a proxy for poverty, which is qualifying for free and reduced meals, which is a federal program that kind of came in when Sputnik happened, and people thought, maybe we ought to invest in education, it'll lead to something productive here, going way back. But that proxy of free and reduced meals, what do you think is the percentage of kids that would qualify for that in the Pasadena Unified School District? So that's a family of 4 earning basically less than $35,000. Throw out some numbers of what you think is the percentage of free and reduced in Pasadena. 40, 80, 30, 70. Yeah, it's pretty close to 70%. So in Pasadena, part of that is a function of the middle class has largely pulled out of the public schools. And even though when you look at, PUSD, there is, PUSD high school graduates going to Caltech and MIT and Berkeley and Stanford and some of the best institutions in the country, the majority of kids are, living in conditions that don't offer a lot of support and create all kinds of challenges in terms of, the impacts of poverty, of healthcare, of parental education levels, of just the ability of a family to navigate the education system and college, and all of the things associated with that. Pasadena is actually pretty much on par in terms of demographics and that socioeconomic level with LA Unified. And across the state, like I said, the majority of children qualify for free and reduced meals. So that's part of the reason why this change in the funding formula to give more money to the neediest kids is important. Previously, we had a system that was really fairly wacky, and it was kind of grandfathered in old pieces of going way back. So the highest funded per pupil district in LA County was Beverly Hills, right? Made no sense. So very positive that we made this change, and the governor really pushed that through, and that was a big deal. Just quickly, the other couple of things here that are kind of big issues are changes in the state priorities. So it used to be school quality was really about how did kids do on math scores and language arts scores. That was it, right? Nothing else really was a factor of what we considered school quality. Now the state has introduced this set of 8 measures of school quality, which include, certainly student achievement is still there, but it includes things like student engagement, school climate issues, the perceived safety, the interrelationships between the adults and the kids, implementation of Common Core, parent involvement, course access. So the idea is to really broaden out what makes a quality school, because these other underlying conditions really are what lead to education success. I mean, you can't have a kid who's afraid of, their own, getting beat up or getting bullied, and there's no adult on campus that they can go to, and there's no access to certain classes, and then you just look at, well, how did they do in their math quiz, right? So that broader measure is really a positive step. The thing I want to talk about, to conclude here is, schools are under tremendous pressure to really deliver very high levels of educational attainment across the board, and there's just a tremendous amount that gets dumped on public education. So if you ask teachers, what are they frustrated with? Well, they're frustrated with, they've got big class sizes. They're not only the teacher, they're the nurse, they're the social worker, the mother, the this, that, and the other. What we really need to do in terms of trying to build support and to put enough resources and capacity in schools is to link the community in really deep, aligned ways in order to give schools a fighting chance to do all the things we're asking them to do. So there's a growing movement across the country called community schools, which really is looking at how do you align all of these resources in a community to support student success. So when you say align the resources, that means how do you get city government involved, or the county government, social service agencies to provide things like school-based health centers. How do you, get the business community engaged so that you can do job shadowing or apprenticeships, and kids have some ability to understand, what's the world of work like? What would I like to do? What's engaging to me? Those issues of, how you get the YMCA and the Boys and Girls Club to do extended learning after school programs that are really aligned to what the kids are learning that day in the classroom. That's the kind of alignment that we really need in order to leverage the limited time that kids have in the classroom and the limited support that they have, especially when you look at the equity issues associated with children living in poverty. The U.S. has essentially the highest child poverty rate of any industrialized nation. So looking at how we make those linkages, I'm happy to say Pasadena has really taken a good leadership role in this, and has been working on a thing which is now called Collaborate Pasadena, and it's looking at how the city and nonprofits and business can align with activities in the school district. So that's a really positive thing. There's more and more of that going on. There are opportunities for all of you, especially with your entrepreneurial skills, your sort of path into the innovative businesses that you're a part of, to go in and talk to students, to have a student just spend a day with you and understand what is it that you actually do. What does it mean to be a tech entrepreneur? What does it mean to be a programmer? What is it like to be in a company and, have a set of expectations that, are probably fairly different than what you're doing in your high school, day. So I would encourage all of you, and I can, if you're interested in doing any of that, I'm happy to get your cards, and I can pass it along to the school district. They have a thing called linked learning, which is basically a strategy that looks at how do you basically create sort of industry-related academies in high schools and then link those to the local business community. And so there are opportunities. There are a couple of folks whose job in the school district is just to do that coordination. And the biggest challenge we've got out there is it isn't that we need lots of new programs. We have loads of things happening. The challenge is in connecting them actually to the students and families that need the resources. You see over and over where there's a big disconnect between understanding how to navigate the system, who to go to, where I could get this kind of service. It's not that it doesn't exist, it's making those linkages. So again, lots happening in change in terms of education, both nationally and particularly in California, and a huge amount of opportunity and a gigantic need to ensure that the 6 million kids in California come out of their high school with the sort of skill set, the sort of, mindset of, sort of being entrepreneurial, being self-motivated, having the agency to navigate the system themselves when somebody doesn't say, do it exactly like this. Because most of the kids of this state don't have a parent that's been, to college, don't have a parent that can do all of those things that can help what a middle-class family takes for granted. So I know we're going to wrap up here. Thank you for being here. I'm happy to answer questions, and hopefully you found some of that useful new information.
Thank you, Ed.